But yeah, so Professor O'Keefe and Professor Remy have a whole program devised for you about how they're going to introduce each other's books to you. So I'm going to just leave them to it. Thank you guys so much for doing this for us.
All right, well, thank you so much to Professor Mancia for always organizing such a fascinating slate of events for us to all participate in. But thank you all of our attendees for showing up on a gray Tuesday afternoon and wanting to hear us converse about our books and put our books in conversation. And there will be ample time for you also to join in the conversation and ask some questions. But our idea was first we would kind of engage with one another and set us off by putting our books in conversation. So how it will work for a little while is we're going to both say a little something about the other's book, and then we're going to pose to one another a series of questions. And then by that time, once we get through our questions, maybe it will have sparked something that the rest of you want to ask us. So I will start us off. And I will say that it was my great pleasure to have an early opportunity to take a look at Professor Stephen Remy's forthcoming book, which is titled Adolf Hitler, A Reference Guide to His Life and Works, which is coming out with Rowman and Littlefield in November of 2021. This book is an extraordinary contribution to the field of modern Germany and the study of Nazi Germany in particular. And it's the kind of book, as Professor Mancia already alluded to, that every library should have a copy, at least one, maybe two, three, on their shelves, precisely because it's an enormously useful text that any student or scholar of Nazi Germany would want to have nearby and at the ready whenever they're kind of going through their work. I also think that it was a kind of breath of fresh air for me to have a chance to look at, because while Professor Remy and I are both historians in the field of modern Europe, I will say that recently within my own kind of subfield of Soviet history, there's been this kind of tremendous rush towards producing these mammoth volumes, sometimes multi-volume, 1,200 pages in a 3-volume set, that I think was somewhat sparked by the centennial of the Bolshevik Revolution. But here, what Professor Remy has done is he's offered students and scholars alike a kind of trim, economical, but yet still kind of thought-provoking volume that also doubly serves as a useful, handy reference work. And I immediately, when I picked up Professor Remy's book, saw other connections to a field and historiographical debate that is very close to me and my own teaching and research interests, right? So those of you who have maybe taken a class with me, I don't know if any of you have, on the history of Stalinism, this little moment that stuck with me from the outset will not surprise you. But Professor Remy writes in his preface, as one American historian pointed out recently, when the full, seemingly unprecedented horrors of the war were revealed after 1945, Hitler became incomparable, historically incomparable, Western civilization's new archetype of evil. To a certain extent, he has retained that position to the present day, though now it is common to compare sitting or would-be dictators to Hitler. Neither form of comparison has been helpful for understanding his life and his impact on the world, right? In the subsequent paragraph, which is equally important, Professor Remy makes a truly kind of important point about how in this kind of flattening demonization of Hitler, right? It's very easy to demonize Hitler, right? That's not the point. The kind of historical circumstances of his rise and what shaped him, and the full import of his ideological motivations get absolutely lost, right? They're under-explained, they're under-theorized, and they're left largely unremarked upon, right? At best taken for granted, at worst not considered at all. So this struck me because in my field of Soviet history, right, for several generations, the biographies of Stalin tended towards the same kind of ahistorical caricature, right? Where Stalin is kind of revealed in this flattened kind of portrait. His father beat him, therefore he was an unhappy young man. And this somehow explains how 3 to 5 million peasants die in the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, right? So I think that Professor Remy and I both, right, in the kind of ways in which our particular fields of research intersect, have a very vested interest in making, which shouldn't surprise any of us, right, in making a kind of determined argument for the importance of historicism, right? It's this kind of irony that these huge figures of 20th century world history and these huge tyrants of 20th century European history are somehow, in many of the biographies that have written about them, reduced to caricature and not fully historicized, by which of course I mean, right, not put in their own time, in their own place, and understood and explained on their own terms. So as one historian to another, I very much appreciated Professor Remy taking that opportunity at the outset to kind of make this determined plea to let us as historians kind of fulfill our ethical principles and fulfill our values and our commitment to historicism. In terms of the specific ideas or themes that animate our two new books, right? The characters that dominate our two new books in many ways couldn't be more different from one another, right? The person, the historical figure that inspired my book was growing up an obscure Jew living in the Western borderlands of the Tsarist Empire, and who was watching how his society was kind of thrown into a kind of social, economic, and political disarray, and who felt in a very visceral and existential way the pains of being a Jewish young man in a society that had a kind of notorious regime of anti-Semitism that framed his personal existence, but also that framed interethnic relations in the Russian Empire. And this young man, his name was Zamenhof, Ludovic Zamenhof, and his kind of aching search for a solution to all that ailed humanity, right, was to come up with a novel international auxiliary language that he created with his own creative genius, and that he called Esperanto. He would later be spat upon quite energetically by Hitler himself as someone who was just adding another layer to what Hitler would call the Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. Now, Zamenhof dies in 1917, but there's another kind of really tragic way in which the stories that Professor Remy and I tell intersect. And that is that all three of Zamenhof's children were murdered in the Holocaust. So even just in that kind of brief brushstroke manner, we can see how these two individuals couldn't have been farther apart in terms of how they interpreted the world and sought to refashion the world and sought to improve upon the world. But there is, however, a way in which they come together, right? And I think it's always a great opportunity, especially on a Tuesday afternoon, to promote the work of awesome women historians. So I was thinking about this and the connections between our books, and I was thinking about a book that helped to inspire the framing of mine. And it's a book by the historian named Holly Case, and it's called The Age of Questions. It has the longest subtitle of any academic monograph I've ever seen. But essentially she argues, right, that the long 19th century, and in modern Europe in particular, in the late 19th and early 20th century, public and social discourse was kind of entirely amped up, right? And you have all of these different disparate competing voices engaging in what were perceived as absolutely all or nothing urgent debates, right? We have all of these things that are ailing our world and our society, and we must come up with decisive and final solutions to these problems. Obviously, the solutions that Zamenhof and Hitler offered the world were extraordinarily different in scope and intention. But they were both ultimately overdetermined by this impulse, this kind of cultural impulse to locate, right, what each of these two very different thinkers had determined was the big sore festering at the heart of human existence, and to come up with and persuade their communities, their larger societies, and ultimately the world that their answer to these urgent questions was the one and sole answer. That's that's how I would like to kind of introduce the way in which our books speak to each other, while also kind of tipping my hat again to Professor Remy for the extraordinary contribution he is offering all of us. But I want to kick off now and ask Professor Remy my first question. And that is to say, I wanted to ask, since this is a book that is, kind of built as a way to efficiently provide an overview of the historiography, I wanted to ask Professor Remy to think back and think about, of all the monographs that he has studied or read or spent time with that provide an interpretation for how we can best understand Nazi Germany, which monograph perhaps most stands out as kind of having left a lasting influence on how Professor Remy interprets Nazi Germany? And similarly, right, if you think of all of the many biographies that Professor Remy has read in his career, which one do you think, right, most influenced how you think of Hitler, the man and the historical figure? Which one might you most recommend we spend some time with?
Well, Professor O'Keefe, thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. And just to back up a bit, Professor Mancia, thank you as always for organizing these events. They have, I think, since you started doing this has transformed our department, and I don't think that's an overstatement at all. And it's just been absolutely great to participate in them and to attend them. And to everyone here, welcome. I see some familiar faces and some that I don't know. So it's great to be here. Should I just go right to the question, or should I do my my own bit about my own general comments about Professor O'Keefe's book? I know we discussed this in advance and went right out of my head.
Why don't you answer my question and then you do your blurb,
All right.
And then the question to me.
Okay, great. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. All right. One of the reasons I agreed to write, this is the first reference book I've ever written. And one of the ways that the major way in terms of format that our books are different is that this is a reference work. It's not based on archival research. I actually picked a very, very good time to write a book that did not depend on me spending any time in archives abroad. That was just pure dumb luck. And Professor O'Keefe's is a very much a true historical monograph that is archivally based, and it also engages in a number of different historiographies. Okay, but to get to the question, in terms of monographs about Nazi Germany, there's so many, of course, but the one that I have a very well-thumbed copy of, it played a role in this book and it plays a role in my teaching, is a fairly recent book by the historian Shelley Baranowski about the modern German Empire. And I like it for a couple of reasons. One is that it crosses traditional chronological boundaries, right? The Nazi regime, Hitler comes to power in 1933, the regime falls in 1945, and Hitler takes his own life, and he did take his own life, just so we're clear about that, in 1945. This is a book that crosses those boundaries. Shelley Baranowski begins in the 19th century and then goes through several different German regimes, 3 different German regimes through the Nazi period. So I like it for that reason, because it crosses chronological boundaries. And I did some of this myself in my first book, which is a study of how academics and scientists in Nazi Germany responded to the Nazis, and then what they said about how they responded after 1945. So I'm always drawn to books that cross these chronological boundaries, and Professor O'Keefe's book does the same thing, from the imperial period to the Bolshevik period, and it's one of the reasons why I think I liked it so much, and I think it's so important. So that as a monograph stands out to me. Now, you asked about biography. So another reason I decided to write this book is that the Germans have a term for this phenomenon. They call it Hitler waves or Hitlerwellen. And they come up periodically, right? These are these bursts of intense scholarly and popular interest in Hitler. And it comes out in a number of ways, some good, some not so good. But when I began writing this book, well, by the time I finished it, 4 new full biographies of Hitler had been published by major scholars, by major presses in Germany and the United States. And now they're all except one are available in English. In the end, though, to answer your question, I still think a 2-volume biography by a British historian, Ian Kershaw, is still the best. The recent ones are I think all they're all very good, but Kershaw's is the best, and here's why I think this is the case. Quickly, Ian Kershaw was trained as a social historian, actually a historian of medieval Europe, but he became a social historian, began his career investigating the social history of the Nazi regime in Bavaria in southern Germany. So in a lot of ways, he seemed like an unlikely person to take on a full-scale, very traditional in most ways, biography of Adolf Hitler, but he does it. And what I think makes it so enduringly valuable is that he's not uninterested in Hitler as a person, but Hitler's personality is less significant for him than the way that he wielded power, his relationship to the wider German elite, the wider German public, how it was that somebody who spent over half his life in total obscurity, a nobody, who bore none of the markers at the time that would point toward becoming a national leader, how it was this person became what he did. And it wasn't just because of Hitler. This is not an argument that Hitler was any kind of puppet or a so-called weak dictator, which some West German historians made that argument in the 1970s. It's not that at all. But he balances those two. Hitler the politician, Hitler the ideologue, and the way that he exercised power and the reception of Hitler in Germany. I recommend it. There's a 1-volume version of it. I think if you're going to do it, if you're going to put that commitment into it, do both volumes. The 1 volume, it's not bad, but you really want the full story. Ian Kershaw's first volume is Hubris. The second volume is Nemesis. Okay, and I'll stop there. So then let me say a few things about Professor O'Keefe's book. First off, before I get to the substance, let me just say that you are such a wonderful writer. For all the students out there, one of the ways that you become a better writer is by reading great writing. And this is not just a lesson that applies while you're a student. It's a lifelong project as far as I'm concerned. But I think in terms of your writing, you have this enviable ability to combine concision, precision, but also elegance in your writing, and it's an impressive achievement. Okay, that is beyond that. This is a book that touches on on many different areas, and this is where I think it's probably most valuable to me. Professor O'Keefe and I have another connection, actually, beyond this book and the timing and everything like that. We both attended Ohio University, me as a graduate student, Professor O'Keefe is an undergraduate, and we both have studied Russian history with Stephen Miner, who still teaches at Ohio University, major influence on me. I specialized in modern German history, but I took as many courses as I could with Stephen Miner. So I learned a little bit about Russia. That said, I always like reading books that are outside my area of specialization. And this is a perfect example of that, because this is not just a book about Imperial Russia and the Bolsheviks. This is a book about empire. And I can maybe bring this up later, but it does a dazzling job of showing how intermeshed, how interconnected the local and the global were, which I think is a major virtue. It's international history, I think, in the very best sense. And it's again, it's a history of empires. The nature of the imperial borderlands to the origins of the Esperanto project is I think one of the great strengths of this book. I really wasn't aware of this burgeoning historiography on the internationalization of the Bolshevik Revolution. Now I'm very curious, but this was my introduction to it. So that's another facet of it that really grasped me. So it's really a multifaceted achievement. It is not a story with a particularly happy ending, although the whole question of what constitutes failure. I mean, look, what little I knew about Esperanto, I always thought, it bombed, right? Well, I really had to rethink that after reading this book. That's way too simplistic a conclusion. But those are some issues I can get into, maybe get into later if there's time. Let me get to a question then. It has to do with the connection between that historians try to make between the present and the past, and the past and the present. And you write briefly in the introduction, you make reference to the present in the introduction in a way that's I think very appropriate and thoughtful. But one of the things I got out of this book has to do with something I've been thinking about for a little while now, and that is the way that historians are always trying to connect the present to the past, right? And we do so, I think, because it's intellectually valuable, it's socially valuable. We do it for the benefit of our students. We do it for the benefit of our presses and our editors and the marketing departments. But one of the things I got out of your book is this is a deep dive into a vision of the future that didn't, of course, turn out the way that I think that Zamenhof would have imagined. I mean, he dies in 1917, so we don't know. But it doesn't become a global auxiliary language the way that he envisioned it, right? But still, this is a vision of the future and from the past. And what it made me think was, and this is the question I want to ask you: do you think that historians need to pay more attention to what was different about the past, to projects that didn't go the way that their creators imagined, things that came to various kinds of dead ends or just morphed into something else? And I think about this a lot because I heard someone say one time a few years ago that if we want a different future, we have to think differently about the past. And use the study of the past to make the present unfamiliar to us. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and what it was like to delve into this into this world that imagined a different future for humanity. I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Professor Remy, for the kind words, but also for a question that kind of gets right to the heart of my own historian's heart. As Professor Remy mentioned, we both are from Ohio in some way, right? And those of you in the room who actually know me in real life or have had experience with me know that I can have a certain unshakable Midwestern cheeriness about me. But that Midwestern cheeriness is oftentimes confusing to people who get to know me better, because there's a reason why I'm saying all of this. It's not just narcissism. The Midwestern cheeriness can be confusing because I also tend towards cynicism and sarcasm and snark, even catastrophic thinking about certain things. And, you know, as someone who spent a long time suffering Russian and Soviet history and almost kind of occupational fatalism. But the reason why I say this is because I think that one of the things that has always fascinated me most about the type of histories that most intrigue me and attract my attention and that I want to write about and that I want to geek out about with my students in class are from a time or a period that is most kind of exciting to me, precisely because I look at it and I see how the historical subjects who fascinated with me hadn't kind of shut their eyes to possibilities, right? I think about the late 19th and 20th century and early 20th centuries. And of course, right, this is, as I said earlier, an era that also helped produce Adolf Hitler and Nazism. But I look at this period of history and I'm drawn most of all, whether it's me spending my time studying late imperial Russia or the early Soviet Union or wider European history, I'm drawn most of all to how people were alive with fantastic and bright-eyed and very earnest dreaming, right? A kind of a unshakable desire to refashion their worlds, but an unabashed confidence that they could do it, right? I know this is not particular to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's just that that's the period that I most am attracted to. I'm sure Professor Mancia could tell us about medieval versions of this. And I know that Professor Rawson teaches a whole class on the history of the future and how people have differently imagined the future. But Steve, the reason why I like your question so much is because maybe when I spend years looking at Esperantists kind of charging up their uphill battle to save the world with a novel international auxiliary language, maybe it doesn't totally wear away at my own cynicism or my own kind of pessimism about current times. But I feel that I take some certain energy and some kind of hopefulness does rub off on me. And I think that you actually are hitting on something that's important, right? If we want to, I think you're right that if we want to change the world, right, we might want to resurrect or build on some of that wide-eyed possibility that seems so distant from our own kind of contemporary moment of deadlock and grimness and bleakness and there's no way out, right? From the kind of from the modernity that we've created and trapped ourselves in. So I think absolutely one of the reasons why I actually wanted to write this book is because Esperantists, as they first emerged, right, were kind of very novel, wide-eyed, effervescent, enthusiastic, against all odds, chasing after a very quixotic dream, and a quixotic dream that was designed towards uplifting all of humanity, right, and getting people in conversation. And something that I write about a lot in the first chapter is how ultimately Zamenhof's vision, right, for the international language that he created was trying to find a way to not only get people all over the world in effective conversation with one another, but how to get them in effective conversation with one another so that they could cultivate and realize and make manifest in those conversations real and true empathy, right? As a historian, right, that's also, right, like a chase after my heart, and kind of one of the only things that really gives me hope about past, present, or future is our capacity, hopefully, to actually make good on human empathy. I will, my last comment in regards to this question is just another kind of invocation, however, of Holly Case's book, The Age of Questions. Because as much as I look back in this era and I see this kind of wide open possibility and this hopefulness and this dreaming that seems very distant from my own time, one thing that does seem very similar is precisely this dynamic that she's talking about, how public debate in this age of questions, as she calls it, was oriented towards this kind of feverish elevation of big questions as urgent questions that demanded black and white, definitive, singular answers, right? I feel like that's a lot of what is happening in our own time, in our old world, in our own society, right? That there's the dynamic she's talking about, how is in framing these questions of the age, the Jewish question, the Polish question, the international language question, they were presented rhetorically as questions, but what the debaters were actually doing was pushing single-minded solutions, right? And not actually trying to open up and engage in debate, right? I sometimes feel like that is something that is really hampering us as a global people, but also as very local communities and national community in 2021 as well. So I think there's a requisite place for both considerations, right? Similarity and relevance, and we can learn from maybe we can learn from both of these things. All right, I have another question for Professor Remy. It's another historiography question. And since I asked Professor Remy before about monographs previously published that most impacted him, I wanted to ask Professor Remy to reflect on maybe emerging trends within the historiography that is currently being produced on Nazi Germany and or Hitler, the man. And I wanted Professor Remy to tell us if he has discerned or picked up on any kind of exciting trends in the field, or things that he would like to see scholars ask or do differently, how they might approach these big topics in modern German and world history from new angles. Anything that might give you some excitement.
Yeah, I think when it comes to Nazi Germany, I think that there's still a lot we can learn about continuities between the Nazi period and the post-war period, and there is a lot of literature out there that crosses that chronological marker, and why there has been, not so much anymore, but has been so much resistance to that that's a whole other topic, which gets into the politics of memory and the fact that there was just so many Nazis, former Nazis, many of them unrepentant, in both Germanys, both post-war Germanys. So I think there's still a lot to be learned. I was also struck, because I wrote a little bit about this online in collaboration with a graduate student at the Graduate Center this summer. They're astonishingly, if you go to look for a good, up-to-date, accessible study of the post-war German far right, you won't find it. That seems incredible to me. And there's a growing body of very high quality article literature in German coming out of Germany, to a lesser extent in the Anglophone world. But this is a huge target for somebody to take on. Now that person has to be not only industrious, but also to some extent courageous to take on that particular subject. But there too is a good example of connections that I think I'm convinced exist in multiple ways between the Nazi period and the post-war German far right that never went away. It sort of ebbed and there's an ebb and flow, and to some extent it's been on the rise in recent years. So that's one important area I can point to. Another quickly has to do with contextualizing Nazi Germany in the wider world, right? And some of this work has already been done, especially when it comes to the regime's biopolitics, situating Nazi Germany in the wider history of eugenics, what the Germans called racial hygiene, so-called. There's been some important recent work on the connections between the United States, the segregated United States, and Jim Crow and laws and the informal forms of segregation and racism in the United States and Nazi Germany. And it's possible to overstate the influence of the United States on Nazi race thinkers, but there is definitely a connection there that exists. So finally, one more point, it has to do with where I would like to see things go. And here's where I potentially could get myself in a little trouble. Some of you may remember in the summer of 2019, the New York Congresswoman, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, I think she had gone to the southern border in the US, and she recorded a video in which she spoke the truth, which was that the United States had constructed concentration camps on its own soil. She used the term concentration camps. And in response, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum issued a statement, which this is a sad moment in my field, that denied the possibility of making any comparisons, drawing any analogies between the concentration camps and between the Holocaust and anything else. That was the problem, right? Now, the upside to this was that a month later, some 600 scholars from around the world, mainly in my field, issued what I thought was a beautifully worded rebuttal of this just profoundly ahistorical way of thinking about any period in history, right? To say that anything historically is incomparable to anything else is hugely problematic. So my point is that I think we need to do more to contextualize the history of Nazi Germany as an imperial and colonial project. Now, it's not original in any way to say that the Nazis tried to build an empire in Eastern Europe, and this was a colonial project. That's not what's controversial. What's controversial, which can be controversial, is the attempt to historicize it, as to use Professor O'Keefe's term, to situate it in the wider history of global empires. So, a part of this, Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, I don't know if she was when she made that statement, if she was drawing on a relatively new literature about the global history of concentration camps, which is wonderful. Maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. But if you follow that literature at all, what she said, there is a wider global history of concentration camps in which the Nazi regime sits, I think. And this is not a I think this is a statement that probably most living historians in my field would agree with. It's still not a consensus position. I just checked the other day, that statement is gone from the Holocaust Museum's website, thank goodness. I don't recall there ever being a retraction, which there should have been. There should have been a public retraction, I think. But and one more thing. Let me say one more thing quickly about this trajectory. I think we should go. This idea that I'm proposing is not new at all, right? If you look at some of the insights of intellectuals and activists in the Black Atlantic tradition, W.E.B. Du Bois, Aimé Césaire, Ralph Bunche in particular, they were saying as early as the 1930s that there was something depressingly familiar about the Nazi project. And the familiarity only increased with the war. And that was that, especially when the war started, that, well, here you have a case of white people doing to other white people what white people have been doing to non-white people for 3 centuries. And yeah, that's right. And this is a way of conceptualizing or historicizing the entire Nazi project, despite these calls from long ago from these scholars and activists. We need to do more with, I think. Wait, now it's my turn, right? Okay, good. I just want to come back to something that I mentioned before, which is the relationship between the global and the local. And when I was reading your book, I immediately was thinking about comments that historian at Princeton, Jeremy Edelman, made a few years ago on a terrific website called aeon.co, aeon.co, which both Professor O'Keefe and I contributed to. He was taking current global historians to task, right, for ignoring, in his view, ignoring the local, right? And he thought that too many current global historians were too enamored of networks and the connections of everything to everybody, and walls coming down and boundaries coming down, and not really paying enough attention to the local, right? And of course, he's writing this in the era of Trump, in the era of intensified nationalism around the world. And the thing is that okay, I thought that made kind of sense to me. Then I'm reading Professor O'Keefe's book, and I thought, no, this is a false dichotomy to try to make this kind of hard distinction between the global and the local, because so much of your book, as I read it, just shows how interconnected they were. And so my question then would be, I would just love to hear your comments on how you worked with that, how you came to this this really complex meshing of the global and the local. And if you think, by extension, if you think that this is a project that more historians should be more engaged with.
Thank you so much. This is a great question. I'm going to repeat something that I say to my students all the time, which is to say, human beings are messy, right? And they're complicated, and they can be all over the place. They can certainly be inconsistent, but they can also be thoughtfully engaging the world on multiple registers and on multiple levels, right? So just at first brush, I think that the Esperantists that I'm studying here kind of absolutely derail and dismantle the argument that you put forward that you had problems with by Edelman, right? Which is that, and I want to also say, in response to the question that you tacked on at the end, right? Should more people be paying attention to the Esperantists, right? In part, what I'm doing here is my kind of is my own curious trick, which I'm saying, right? People who have at best been resigned only to the margins or the footnotes of European history, right? If we put them under the historian's magnifying glass, we can actually see that they weren't outliers, but they were also kind of representative of their era, right? So the Esperantists I'm kind of putting forward as exemplary, ordinary people of their time. And I think that they exemplify, Steve, the capacity for ordinary people all throughout Europe and the world, right? My focus is on Russia and the Soviet Union, but Esperanto was a global movement. Ordinary people to absolutely and energetically and thoughtfully, consciously, as I say, fashion themselves patriotic cosmopolitans, right? They were able to thoughtfully connect being invested with what they understood to be the kind of overriding internationality of their age, right? They looked around, everything is becoming more and more international. And they thought there are reasonable, humane, and thoughtful ways in which I, as a human being, right? The words we would use as historians, right? As human beings with agency, right? But they might say, just as Zamenhof said, I, as a human being, I am many things, right? I'm someone who's from this podunk town in the Pale of Settlement. I'm also someone who feels an affinity with Jews all over the world, right? And I feel an investment in kind of trying to come to humane terms with the anguished Jewish question, which is one of the things Zamenhof was doing. And I'm also a member of an empire, right? So I'm a member of a Russian empire, and that has meaning for me. And maybe, right, in acting and kind of asserting myself on a global register and asserting myself as a global actor, right, I can meaningfully chase after and bring change that would operate on every one of those registers. I don't think the Esperantists were that unusual for their time, but I think that they, again, this is kind of that leads back to my answer to your other question before. There's a kind of optimism there and a bright-eyedness there that I think sometimes we're too beaten down in our contemporary moment to imagine for ourselves, right? That there was no, in an age in which, right, there were all these ideological drives to flatten humanity, right? To carve people up, according to national, right? This is a heyday of modern nationalism as well, right? To flatten people according to national identities, the heyday of racist and eugenicist thinking, flatten people on racial identities. You have these ordinary people kind of reaching out really hopefully to the world and saying, we can communicate on a purely human and humane level. And that has meaning to me as someone who is, who belongs to a certain ethnicity, who belongs to a larger empire, but who also values and appreciates and wants to belong to the world, right? One of the historians that I benefited from, another woman historian named Emily Rosenberg. I thought that she stated it rather beautifully, so beautifully that I quoted her in my book. But she essentially reminds us, right? The local, the regional, the imperial, the national, the global, right? Many people in the past, but also in the present, we live in all of those spaces at the same time, right? I think that the Esperantists intuitively understood and appreciated it, and very consciously were acting on that impulse. I'll just give you an example of one Russian Esperantist. He was like an early adopter in 1891, who made the argument that the Russian Empire should be the first major state in the world to embrace and push Esperanto as a global language. And he fought against the notion that if you're a globalist, then you can't be patriotic, or if you're a globalist, you can't be invested in your own country, your own empire, and all the rest. But he argued in 1891, thoughtful people who are idealistic, humane, and who are imbued with strong desire to help their fatherland and all of humanity cannot help but sympathize with the great idea of Esperanto. You can help and benefit and contribute to your locale, your nation, your empire, and contribute to making the world a better place at the same time. I think we need more people like this. That's all I will say about that, because I also know that I'm a bit of a talker. And we have to leave some time for other people to ask questions. But I will ask Professor Remy my last question, which is a question designed to have us to consider the connection between the present and the past, and the present and the teaching of the past. And so my question is this: our contemporary discourse in American life is undoubtedly as anguished as it is impoverished. And we live in a time and in a culture in which ordinary people are content to give voice to all of their conglomerations of beliefs on the internet and on TV, but who cannot make a distinction ideologically between Nazism and communism, between fascism and democratic socialism, between Hitler and Stalin. We live in a time in which you have people protesting vaccine mandates by wearing Jewish badges of the like that Nazi Germany forced Jews to wear in the 1930s. And so my question to Professor Remy is, what do you think needs to happen, or what do you think could happen that could help us maybe, right, embrace some of the spirit of my Esperantists, right, to contribute to the healing or the improving upon the discourse locally, nationally, and ultimately globally? What can we do to get ourselves out of the dead end moment in which, no matter where you are really on the ideological spectrum in the United States, there's a kind of knee-jerk impulse to label your enemies as Hitler or as Nazis?
Well, I can answer this one fairly concisely, I think, or at least offer one suggestion. All right, one fairly concise suggestion. Some of you may be familiar with the term Godwin's law. It's a reference to an American lawyer named Godwin, who I think in the 90s or maybe in the early 2000s came up with Godwin's law. And it simply is this idea that the longer a debate about politics goes on online, the greater the chances that it will terminate in somebody making a Hitler reference and calling somebody else a Nazi. This is Godwin's law. And yeah, okay, that's kind of funny. That's kind of amusing. It's not amusing, though, to see the kind of to live in the world where we have the kind of discourse that Professor O'Keefe was describing. So here's my one contribution to this is that we have to take Adolf Hitler down as this paragon of incomparable evil. And this is related to my comments earlier. The project of normalizing Hitler has gone on for a long time. My friend and the very brilliant historian Gabriel Rosenfeld has written about this. I mean, there have been cinematic satires of Hitler going back to the 1930s. This is a longstanding tradition in popular culture. But okay, I think more seriously though, Hitler cannot be, I think, permitted to stand as this ultimate symbol of all political evil. I want to live in a world where nobody, Godwin's law is a relic. It just doesn't apply anymore because nobody goes that route. Nobody starts throwing these terms around and these accusations and labels around. So that's what I would say about that.
Thank you.
So my last question for Professor O'Keefe is unusually concise for the way that I normally ask questions. It has to do with the present past connection. Do you think that English and now sitting here in 2021, and you travel around the world, so but do you think that English has become a kind of Esperanto? Not in the way that I would think that Zamenhof would have envisioned, but maybe in some ways, or maybe not. But has it become a global auxiliary language? See, that's it. That's my question.
Thank you. This is a great question. English has certainly become, by political default, an international language, right? The global language, right? In the book, following larger kind of discussions of linguists and other scholars of languages, I use the capitalized version of global English to demarcate, right, this special quality of the English language today, where we all expect that it's the language, right? If you want to communicate in an international setting. This is an extraordinarily recent phenomenon, right? I mean, this is in Zamenhof's own time, while people were debating, what do we do about a world that is increasingly interconnected and interdependent, but we all speak these different languages. There was early in the time the Esperantists were getting off, there were kind of small voices making the argument that of course English should be the universal language, but they were even more marginal than the Esperantists in the debate, right? This is the late 19th, early 20th century. And I cannot help but feel, right, the pain and the anguish and the kind of embarrassment of traveling abroad to a place where I don't speak the local language and kind of shamefacedly ordering a coffee in English. I kind of feel even more shamefaced about it now, having written this book than I did before I wrote it. But for Zamenhof, there's a difference between an international auxiliary language and an international language. Esperanto was supposed to do something very special, and it was supposed to accomplish something beyond facilitating efficient and effective communication in a globalizing world. He wanted, there were moral properties and kind of qualities to Esperanto that he fully intended to transform people's psychology, with the hope that it would transform how people behave and understand themselves and one another in a patently global world. So when he calls Esperanto an international auxiliary language, what he meant was it was going to be no one's first native language. Everyone would have to do a little bit of work to learn Esperanto, right? And that was in many ways the point, right? Because when you get people from all over the world together in one room, and they've all learned Esperanto and had to struggle, right, to learn Esperanto as a second language, they will all communicate on an equal footing. And so they won't look at, even subconsciously, one another according to kind of civilizational hierarchies, right? This was this idea. And when he talked about Esperanto and he talked about linguistic chauvinism, or he talked about, right, why and how, if we wanted to solve the international language problem, you couldn't use a national language. You couldn't use English, you couldn't use Portuguese, you couldn't use Spanish, you couldn't use French. It was because he believed that non-native speakers of those languages would always be put in a position of less than and humiliation, right? That it would be an unequal encounter that would derail the larger, very optimistic vision he had for his international auxiliary language, right? Esperanto, he hoped, wasn't just going to allow us to send invoices or exchange goods or travel more seamlessly in different countries. He wanted Esperanto to transform how humanity interacted, right? And how they understood one another as on a shared, equal, level playing field of humanity. So yeah, he died in 1917, so he doesn't know a lot of what even happens in my book, but I think he would be pretty heartbroken and annoyed at global English kind of winning the debate of how we're to function in a globalized world with many different native languages. I'll leave my comments there at that. I think Professor Mancia,
Yes.
Now we get to do open Q&A.
We do. Thank you both for a very fascinating conversation and such an education in late 19th, early 20th century stuff. We've got a chat full of books to read and ideas to contemplate. So thank you. If you have a question or a comment, you can put your little yellow hand up. You can press reactions, and that's where the raise hand function is. You can also pop a question into the chat, and I'm happy to read it out loud for you. Fernanda.
Hi. So my question is for Professor Remy. In your Google Books, like little summary preface, like I don't know what to call it, you put in a quote by Sebastian Haffner. that said, for the world to be done with Hitler, it had to kill not just the man, but the legend as well. And then you also just mentioned that like you'd love to live in a world where people wouldn't just be throwing around his name and stuff like that. So basically my question is, what do you think, in your opinion, would happen if the world not like forgot about Hitler, but like kind of forgot about Hitler in a way? How would we like go about that?
Well, first of all, it's nice to see you, Fernanda. I hope you're well. And I thank you for coming. I want to be clear about something. By historicizing Hitler, by contextualizing Hitler and the wider Nazi project, I don't want anybody to leave this presentation thinking that I'm suggesting that we forget or we marginalize this person. There is no question that this is an individual whose life had a monumental significance for the 20th century, and we're still living with, in some ways, with the legacy of the Second World War in Europe, that dimension of this wider global war. So I definitely want to make that absolutely clear. I believe that the history of Nazi Germany should be taught about honestly in schools. I think it should be I think it should be memorialized in public, and I think it should be never forgotten. I don't think that those things should happen at the expense of somehow at the expense of remembering and memorializing and compensating for other instances of past and ongoing gross injustice, including genocide. I do think that, and again, just to be clear, I think human suffering is indivisible. I think, and it's not suffering is not a competition. So I definitely don't want to live in a world in which we have forgotten Hitler. I do. Well, what can I say? I've said it already. I think that he should not be held up as a incomparable ultimate paragon of evil.
Thanks. So then what do you think Sebastian Haffner meant when he said to kill the legend?
I think that Sebastian Haffner was a West German historian and journalist, and the author of one of many biographies of Adolf Hitler. And I think just very quickly, if you'll allow me to share an image with you, I'll make this fast. If you can see this, like I sent Professor Mancia this. This is an unusual photograph of Adolf Hitler taken during one of his campaigns in 1932, and it's unusual in the sense that there are very few photographs of the adult Adolf Hitler that are this candid. Here, this is an unusual example of a candid photograph of Hitler. Hitler was terrified of flying. Now, you wouldn't know that from Nazi propaganda. And as I tell my students, the vast majority of images we see of the adult Hitler are what we are seeing is Hitler the way that he wished to be seen and the way that the propaganda ministry wished everyone to see him. He was terrified of flying. But he understood the power of flight, and he was the first politician to campaign in elections using an airplane. But he was a man, he was a human being. And how I read Haffner here is he's telling us, I think, that we need to not be drawn in by the image of Hitler the way that he wanted to be seen. That's the part we've got to kill off. We got to kill off a legend, or at least always be aware of how much time and effort and energy went into Hitler presenting himself to the world in a particular way. So here, I'll get out of this.
Thank you, Professor.
That's the historicism that Professor O'Keefe talked about at the very beginning too. Oh gosh, every time. Micah.
Yes, you got it. You got it, Micah.
Second time?
First, yeah, Micah is great. Yeah.
Micah. Oh.
My question is sort of building on this idea more, and it's kind of already been, but just this idea that there has always been and there always will be this sort of great enemy, that there is always this marker of evil in society, whether it is sort of a ambiguous like rebel, or like counter-revolutionary, or the idea of an infidel or a Nazi. In today, it's like it sort of, I guess, like, is it better that these things are cast onto a historical figure than a living figure, if it's some sort of Orwellian living figure that is out there right now? Or is it better that it is in the past? Or is that more dangerous, because then the legacy can be more manipulated and the mythology can build? Yeah.
I want Professor Keefe to take that one. I want to hear what O'Keefe has to say.
Yeah, to Eddie, yeah.
I'm not sure if one or the other is better, but I'm pretty sure both registers are not productive, right? It's really my problem, right? I think that there are two reasons why, at least two reasons. There's more than two reasons, but we only have so much time. There are at least two reasons why it really troubles me and anguishes me that I turn on the news or I turn on the internet, and you know that meme with like the two Spider-Mans pointing at each other? It's like the internet is just like everyone calling the other Hitler, right? Like, and Hitler kind of functionally serves in our very bankrupt discourse as this free-floating signifier of evil, right? Or of enemy status, right? And embedded within that, right, whether people are intending it or not, right, is a minimizing of the actual history that should and needs to matter, right? What I kind of come away from a lot of the terrible discourse of the last year is where, people feel free to kind of walk down the streets and engage in protest and relativize or minimize the history of the Holocaust, is that I think that somehow some of us became convinced that we're teaching Hitler or we're teaching the Holocaust too much, right? I think I've kind of reached the point where I'm thinking maybe we're not teaching it well enough, right? Or maybe we're not reaching enough people with the history, because I feel like if people actually understood the history or were engaged in the thoughtful enterprise of historicizing how not just Hitler emerged, but how Nazism, right, mobilized the entire society, I don't think people would be so quick to casually and thoughtlessly oftentimes just throw out Hitler or Stalin or whichever, it's usually Hitler or Stalin, right, as these kind of free-floating signifiers of evil, right? I think I'll keep my comments at that, but maybe Professor Remy wants to say something about it too.
Well, I agree completely. So I don't really have much to add there. I did think too that that when I can stomach seeing images of anti-vaccination protesters or others, I do see references to communism. Now, I haven't seen one to Stalin. They're probably out. I'm sure they're out there. But what I see more frequently, my unscientific sort of way of approaching this is references to communism, right? And it's not just about vaccines. It's about Joe Biden. Joe Biden is a communist. I get it. Communism is a global project. It's not limited to Russia or the Soviet Union. But okay, I mean, I think it's safe to say that for most people, that's what the reference is, right? Is to the project the Bolsheviks started in the former Russian Empire. There too, I think. I mean, it's stupid. It's just really stupid, that kind of analogy. But that must have struck you. You've seen those images, right? I mean, those references.
Absolutely. I just want to tag on, right? It's stupid, it's unproductive, but it's also dangerous. I have long been convinced, Steve, Professor Remy, that in this country, we do a poor job of ever teaching anyone anything about the Soviet Union or 20th century experiments or pursuit of communism. But so that I've always been convinced of, right? And that enables that kind of like uninformed throwing out these labels. But I think what's particularly come into my frame of understanding in recent years is I did think that actually our school system had been committed to teaching Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And now I'm wondering if we have not been doing such a great job of that either. I don't know. I'm not a high school teacher though, so I don't.
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Hi, my question is for Professor O'Keefe, and it is over your study of the language Esperanto, I think is how you pronounce it. Would you say that Stalin's nationalistic beliefs played a role in the diminishment of the language being widespread?
That's a great question, Elizabeth. There's an interesting detail from Stalin's own biography while he was languishing and bored in Tsar's prison, right? Because he was locked up for engaging in revolutionary activity. He spent a while, supposedly, according to his cellmate, studying Esperanto, right? And Stalin, amongst the Bolsheviks, was actually a kind of outlier amongst the leaders of the Bolshevik Party in the sense that he was multilingual, no doubt, right? He was Georgian, he always spoke Russian with an accent, but he did not ever spend a significant amount of time in Western Europe and never mastered German, which was the lingua franca of the left in the late 19th and early 20th century. And he never learned English or Spanish or any of them and was always pretty embarrassed by it. And his political enemies taunted him about it. But I wouldn't say that it was Stalin's nationalism that doomed the project in the late 1930s under Stalin's rule, although Soviet Esperantism was distinctly doomed and kind of gruesomely and tragically doomed in the late 1930s under Stalin. But it was more it was that the era of the Persian terror of the late 1930s was marked by an extraordinary xenophobia, right? And an overriding kind of fear and suspicion of foreigners and foreign language, or speakers of foreign languages within Soviet society. There was this kind of strange contradictory impulse that coexisted in Stalinist society, where on the one hand, there was an embrace and a pursuit of a socialist internationalism, but also this dangerous and ultimately very violent freak out. I can't think of a better way to say it right now. A freak out about the potential contagion and the potential subversion that foreigners and speakers of foreign languages potentially presented to Soviet society. And Stalin's personality is not the overriding factor, but it's certainly a part of it, right? The Bolsheviks, when they were in their youth, Stalin ends up in jail himself as a young man, where he spent at least some time studying Esperanto, they say. I mean, in their heyday, they were conspirators, right? By definition, they were conspirators. And once in power, Stalin especially has a kind of noted suspicion about potential conspirators trying to bring him down. And when he kind of lashes out and freaks out in the late 1930s, foreigners, but also speakers of foreign languages are really dangerous. And the Esperantists during the purges are seen as particularly dangerous because they speak this unusual international language that even most of the censors that the Soviet state employs to kind of read people's mail and read what they're saying or doing on paper, that many of them don't speak or read. So they're kind of unfortunately, this almost perfect target of the xenophobic thrust of the Persian terror. And many of the Esperantists who were most energetic in the Soviet movement were arrested, exiled to the Gulag, or executed in 1937 and 1939. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's good to see you, by the way.
Good to see you too, Professor.
Robert.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question or a comment, and I don't know which professor I'm addressing it to, but first of all, thank you very much to Professor O'Keefe and Professor Remy for this great conversation. And and when we're talking about the Nazi racial doctrine, I'm thinking of just like how we learned about this just yesterday in your class, Professor O'Keefe, about the shift in Soviet ideology about anti-racist doctrine. And also when we're talking about internationalism, I'm also thinking about the foreign policy of Litvinov in the pre-war era. So I was wondering if either one of you just wanted to comment on like how those two ideas connect, and then also how the sacking of Litvinov and the replacement with Molotov changed that dynamic. And also, I don't know, I'm a little mishkabobble here, so.
I will say something, and then Steve, if you want to build, but I thought I could address what Robert's referencing in terms of what we talked about in my colloquium yesterday. In our colloquium, as Robert alluded to, we were talking about how in the mid 1930s, the Soviets made a tactical shift in terms of their anti-racist messaging, and they switched from a more hardline anti-racist policy to a more soft line, right? And they kind of switched their focus from demonizing racism in the capitalist United States to kind of spending more of their energy talking about the existential threat that Nazism represented to the Soviet Union and also to the world. The other detail he mentioned was in terms of Stalin's Commissar of Foreign Affairs from 1930 to 1939, Maxim Litvinov, whom I've been researching. He had advocated on the world stage for the Soviet state to cultivate alliances with the United States, for example, and other Western capitalist powers on the argument of collective security, right? And basically making the argument that from the Soviet perspective, capitalist states are always and everywhere bad, but some of them are worse than the others, and none was worse than Nazi Germany. So Robert, having kind of brought us all to the shared table, I think actually your question and the connections that you're making and building on together highlight something that both Professor Remy and I both advocate for, right? Professor Remy advocated for it explicitly in his comments, and I advocated for it explicitly in my book, which is that we all benefit when we internationalize the particular national or imperial histories that are our specialties, right? That Russian history or the field of Soviet history for a very long time was very inward looking. And I make the argument that we almost kind of take it for granted that the Bolsheviks were actually, right, intending on sparking a global revolution, and then the whole global aspect kind of got lost historiographically for a really long time. But when we kind of internationalize these specific histories, we learn more about the particular area that we specialize on, but we also learn more about the world, right? And Professor Remy, I don't want to steal his thunder, but I was nodding my head, I'm sure vigorously, while he was saying this earlier in response to one of my questions, that one of the most exciting kind of dynamics of his field is this push towards internationalizing German history. And in the field of Soviet history, I definitely think that the most exciting trend is this move towards thinking about the Soviet Union in and of and implicated in the world. So Steve, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, again, I think we're very much on the same wavelength. And Robert, if I understood where you were coming from, Nazi racism drew from multiple traditions, and one of those traditions was distinctly German, in the sense that German scientists had been pioneers in the German context, and then by extension in the German colonial context in Southern Africa. They were pioneers in the development of so-called scientific racism. Then there's this juncture, right? The Nazis come to power, and those who are not on board, really more basically fully with the project of what becomes the first Nazi genocide. The first Nazi genocide was against the handicapped were targeted in the first Nazi genocide. Those who weren't fully on board were sidelined, just at best, or exiled. And that gave the radicals really free rein. So Yeah, and the one other thing I would add, in terms of it, well, I look at Professor O'Keefe's career, and we were both trained as specialists in a particular area of the world and time period, right? And this happens a lot with historians more and more. We're going more global, right? And our colleagues in this department are also very good examples of that. Professor Sengupta and Professor Banerjee also. And I think that this is a really, really healthy development, and I think it does speak to the need, to reinforce something Professor O'Keefe said, for continuing to train in specific fields and parts of the world. There's still something to be said for that, as providing a foundation for globalizing our work.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Janae?
Hi. I'm in Professor Rawson's class, and our final project for the semester is a historiographical essay. And my topic, my question for my essay is, how have historians framed the debate over the origins of the Holocaust, particularly the functionalism versus intentionalism debate? So I found Professor Remy's book and him talking about his book very interesting. So my question, Professor Remy, is what was your process of gathering research like for this book?
Oh, Lord. I have this running joke. I mean, I took to my colleagues, I think very carefully before you ever agree to write a reference work like this, because I just have to be honest. It was a very rewarding experience. I'm glad I did it. And I had several research assistants, which was proved to be invaluable. But the process involved in my particular case, it involved really just catching up with a lot of recent historiography, because and there are thousands and thousands of books and articles, but I had to be selective. But I knew that this would be, to my knowledge, the first English language biographical encyclopedia of Hitler, and it was a priority for me to make it to have it reflect current historiography. So that's where the emphasis went, to answer your question. So that's how how current is the historiography, right? So when it came to the entry on the Holocaust, what do I say in a couple of pages that is current, or really anything else that I wrote about? Yeah, it was a grind, but it did allow me to catch up on a lot of stuff that I either wasn't aware of or I just hadn't gotten around to reading.
And just for fun, would you consider yourself a functionalist, an intentionalist, or a bit of both?
No, I agree with people like Christopher Browning, who have synthesized the two. I think that debate's a dead horse, intentionalist versus functionalist. And big surprise, it's a kind of combination of the two, right? Which is where we seem to be now. So if anybody is interested in pursuing this, I can recommend just to start with Christopher Browning's recent work.
I included his work because I was doing a lot of research for this. So I just found it interesting. And like you said, I find that the most reasonable answer to that question would always include a mixture of both viewpoints.
Right, and if I could add just one more thing quickly, it's really important to remember too that the genocide of the Jews was a trans-European project. It was initiated by the Germans. I agree with this old proposition that no Hitler, no Holocaust. I think that is the case. And the Germans were the initiators. The Germans pushed it through. It could not have been carried out the way that it was without the willing collaboration of millions of non-German Europeans. still to this day a highly sensitive topic, incredibly so in contemporary Poland, where some of the best historians of the Holocaust are being persecuted right now by the current Polish government. So that has to be always has to be taken into consideration too. This is a pan-European project. That's it.
Thank you.
Professor Fishman, finish us off. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, very good. Thanks both of you for such a thought-provoking talk today. I just wanted to say, now that I should have said this when there's more people here, but I'll be for the first time teaching European Jewish history next semester. The new thing of mine. I'll be doing that. Both these talks, of course, are quite related. Bridget, I think you might not know, but in Tel Aviv, one of my favorite streets is Zamenhof Street. And it's sort of ironic that maybe this is one of the few places that he has a street named after him in the middle of Tel Aviv, meaning that he was not a Zionist. And most street names are named after a Zionist. But this was Einstein himself, I think, was a Zionist also, but he never moved. He never moved to Israel, and he never took the presidency as the offer. So there are a few streets to non-Zionists, but he has one of them, and I was quite surprised to hear that. So that's good. But the whole, I'm not going to ask any really questions, but I think this really, so fascinating me, Bridget. When I'm reading Simon Dubnov and on autonomy of Jews, Jewish autonomic governments, Zionism, the Bund, labor unions, different things like this. That in this little space you also have these people coming from such multilingual backgrounds, speaking 4 or 5 languages, and then being sad that he doesn't speak 3 or 4 more, right? He always speaks 5 or 6 languages, but he doesn't, Yiddish doesn't count as German, of course, for any educated person. And I'm sure by him also. So that was very interesting. So thanks for sharing that with us. Professor Remy, I have to say that a lot of your ideas you're speaking of, I constantly grapple with them in my classes and how I teach Hitler, trying to historicize him, trying to personalize him, make him humanize him on one hand, but also I think the very reluctance to normalize him and to say this. I will say on AOC's comment on concentration camps that it goes both ways. Yes, in historical terms, in my opinion, it is a concentration camp, but when you use it in that sense, you automatically know that it's going to be compared to what we have in our minds, concentration camps of Germany, which of course there's no argument that they're very, very different. So I think I don't think it's only on the far right side. I think someone who identifies with the left, I think there's also that issue of normalizing it at times. I'm sure you would agree and other people would agree, but I just think it need to be said. Last thing is, Bridget, I think very important when we teach Shaping the Modern World, it comes up quite a bit, is they don't know, maybe they had bad lessons on Nazi Germany and Germany in the Holocaust, but this also could be to deter them from teaching American history correctly. And genocide of Native Americans, legacy of slavery, lack of reparations of slavery. So when by focusing on the Holocaust, which I think you absolutely should, right? I think it perhaps is done in a way where people don't study that the same people that died in the Holocaust weren't allowed to enter the ports in New York at the same time. So I think it's like everything is very, very political. The nice thing about America, I'll finish, is that there's autonomy to teach what we want, basically, in our classes. So I think but that always is in my mind when I'm teaching, and how I teach it, and how I teach it different when I'm teaching, let's say, Jewish history or Israeli history in Palestine and Israel. So every class, I teach it very differently in that sense. So, but thanks so much for both of you for a really, really enjoyable afternoon. Yeah, it was great. And thanks, Lauren, for hosting this also.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you to my interlocutor and my great colleague, Professor Remy, and of course, the woman who gets everyone energized in the history department, without whom we would all be lost, Professor Mancia. And thanks for everyone for coming.
Thank you. And students, this just was like a, an ideal example of how to engage with historiography, of how to engage, across disciplinary, across topic, right? Just like the ideal 2001 conversation, essentially, felt like we were witnessing. So thank you both for that. It was really very, very soul-filling, brain-filling. So thank you. So this will be